Hello, beautiful community. We're going to say a few analytical things about the anti-Semitic mob on the rampage in Dagistan. But after a few analytical remarks about that, we're going to ground ourselves by saying a few things about anti-Semitism in general, what it is and what it's not. Then maybe a remark about the Holocaust, which is incredibly important to us in the West. And sometimes the line comes, well, don't talk about it too much. I mean, look at the ghastly things European imperialism did in Africa. But no, if anything, we don't talk about the Holocaust enough, or at least we don't talk about the Holocaust adequately enough. And one of the commitments I have is to give us some grounding around the Holocaust, perhaps on the main channel sometime, which helps us make sense of who we are, where we've come from, and where we might go. So it's very, very important to be in an adequate relationship there, and we'll say a few things about that. Before I do a few analytical remarks about Dagestan, let me just say that I'm proud of you. And I really mean that, because there is not just an analytical mapping issue when there's different crises in the world, you're trying to make sense of them and compare them. So there's Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine, and there's the Hamas, Israel-Gaza, Israel-Palestine crisis. And it's very important, of course, that analytically they don't map. So Russia is not Hamas, and Russia is not Israel, and Ukraine is not Israel. I don't think anybody is arguing that Ukraine's Hamas, so we can leave that fourth possibility aside. But these are not just analytical things. You're dealing with your moral imagination being stretched, your attention being stretched, and you're dealing with weighing things that look very difficult to swallow. The barbarism of 7th October, situation in Gaza. And I'm proud of you for how you're trying to balance this while also balancing your mental health, please, and putting proper buffer in place. So Makhachkala, where the rampaging mob went about, is Caspian Sea, near, I have never been there, it's near Azerbaijan and Georgia. And we had a situation we were looking at with a mob of hundreds. Population of Makhachkala, I don't know what it is, 500,000. So that's terrifying enough, but we've got to have some sense of proportion about the numbers. They were chanting anti-Semitic slogans, waving Palestinian flags, which is deeply disgraceful and taints the Palestinian people. And it was bad. Bad, of course, because of the extraordinary history of Jewish pogroms in Russia. But it was bad because, if any of you know the former comedic character Borat, who is a Jewish man who puts on this extraordinarily anti-Semitic persona, and makes terrible fun at anti-Semitic discourse, anti-Semitic positions. Often he's, of course, terribly mean to Kazakhstan in the process. But I mean, what I want to say here is that this is Borat level stuff. Catch the Jew. And just from a PR perspective, for Russia's global reputation and Russia's soft power, imagine somebody who isn't following any of this closely, how this might look. Well, these Russians look like they're a bunch of mentalists because they just invaded for no good reason their neighbor, and they started murdering their neighbor, and then they got banned from going around and playing in Europe and in Western countries. So what are they up to these days? Yeah, I mean, they're playing Catch the Jew. I mean, that's an absolutely terrible look. As much as we have to emphasize, this was a small gang. Of course, it's worth pointing out that Russia has a huge Muslim population. I mean, really in the millions, into the low tens of millions, I would have thought. 10% perhaps of the Russian population. So that's worth bearing in mind. Let's do causes, cartoonishly. We've got a special video coming on the main channel tomorrow. It's going to be the best video I think I've ever shared. But it's going to be about the interconnectedness of stuff going on in the world, with a lot of comments on Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine too, of course. And so, of course, this is an echo of what is going on in the Middle East. It's also a reflection of the fact that the North Caucasus is a very challenging region for the Kremlin, and they're exchanging loyalty for a lot of local liberties. So you have situations there where political life begins to look like a state within a state. You had more or less public support for Hamas from the Kremlin in recent days. And you've got a grave economic situation there. Huge youth unemployment, exclusion, a lot of folks in the army from that region. And there is a kind of normalization of violence that is becoming a central image that Russian propaganda and the Kremlin ventilate. I mean, this is not just a country that's attacking its neighbor. It's a country that's attacking its neighbor backed by genocidal rhetoric. And it's a country that constantly threatens the world with violence, with nuclear violence. And violence begets violence. What's the Kremlin explanation of this? The Kremlin PR explanation. Ukraine did it. Ukraine somehow sponsored this. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. However, what's worth pointing out is that once this sort of stuff starts, Ukraine will do everything in its power to leverage it, because Ukraine has a policy of destabilization of the Russian space. So that's apparent. Kremlin response. I think there is certainly clarity among public officials in Russia that the Russian opposition are enemies of the Kremlin. But it's not clear who's a friend and who's an enemy immediately when it comes to other kinds of conflict. I mean, when Mr. Prigozhin was marching on Moscow, I believe he was marching against Putin in the fundamental analysis of it, actually. Not to overthrow Putin, but against Putin, with a chance of anything happening. But people felt, what is this? What is this expression of force? Is it anti-regime? Is it for regime? Is it a bit of both? And so when people come out in Russia, often it's hard for officials to map stuff. I mean, are people out because they got overheated in how much they support the regime? And so they're giving kind of intensification of the regime's position, or are they enemies of the regime? How do we tell? In a lovely quick response piece in The Spectator, Mark Galeotti suggested that the mob's behavior will be treated more like treason than like disorder. And I always recommend Mark's off-the-cuff reactions because he has a wonderful way of being able to give live news commentary while remaining responsible. He's a master of responsible off-the-cuff speculation. So the thought is available to the Kremlin that this could be partly welcome, a sort of valve that releases pressure in a region beset by poverty, lawlessness, instability. And so if the pressure is released in that way, it's not directed at us, screw it, could be good. That thought is available to the Kremlin, but it's outweighed by fear. Fear of instability in the region, fear of Ukraine further exploiting that instability, fear that the Russian army isn't available for tasks as it's occupied in Ukraine, as it's brutally occupying Ukraine. And still a lot of trauma post the Prigozhin mutiny. The regime hasn't recovered from that yet. So that idea is what dominates. And I think that idea is, if you like, wisely dominant. In other words, this really is a concern for the Kremlin, part of a story that I don't want to reventilate now. I mentioned it in a community post yesterday, my brief reaction, and that's the story of the dissolution of monopoly over organized violence in Russia. So we've had these sort of expectations set. One of the expectations is that the war is going to increasingly come onto Russian soil. That remains so. And one of the others is that the Putin regime's monopoly over organized violence will float increasingly, will dissolve increasingly. Not to zero, but just right? Experience partial dissolution. Just as an aside comment, for people who rightly talk about the urgent need for decolonization in Russia, political, cultural decolonization is very important. But there's also an extraordinary overdrive and over-romanticization of that discourse, detached from political reality. And this sort of stuff reminds us of the taste of what real decolonization might look like. Let me now, let me just make a little remark about how Putin would see all of it. At the level of a mob hunting for Jews, he would, personally, he would hate that, but he doesn't give a hoot about anything. He just wants what's politically expedient. And so what's paradoxical is that Putin is, to a good extent, a kind of sentimental villain, a kind of unself-conscious villain. he at his at the big picture level of his thinking, Putin sincerely believes he is right and good on many issues. So he's not one of those artifice, manipulator type tyrants who see all the way down what they're up to. Putin is insincere shock at some of the accusations that he's evil, because he's caught up in various mystical and other such pictures of the world. But of course, in many ways, he knows exactly what he's doing, and this is one of them. That's to say, he's been spinning an anti-Semitic story just for the sheer hell of the political expedience of it. He knows all the way down it's BS. So he just lies. He just uses language as political technologies and cultivates things that he himself personally actually wouldn't associate with if it wasn't politically expedient for him. These are good ethical questions. What's worse, a more self-conscious evil or a less self-conscious evil? Let's say a few things now, and if you want to sort of relax, because we're going to get a bit more reflective at this point, or maybe leave even. Let's say a few things about anti-Semitism and a few things about the Holocaust. First, anti-Semitism is a prejudice. And it's very important that as a prejudice, it can be held either at the level of belief or at the level of images. That's to say, you can have disparaging images of a group, you can have disparaging images of Jews, epistemically insupportable images of Jews, images of Jews that perhaps involve certain kinds of self-consciousness, right? Because you kind of believe that everybody is ethically equal, but then you have a prejudice about a certain group, and so there's this conflict that you don't recognize inside you. So you can be prejudiced at the level of belief, but your beliefs can be impeccable, and you can still be deeply prejudiced if your images are prejudiced. Right? It's very important. You can say, give me a questionnaire about my views about Jews. You can do everything perfectly on the questionnaire, but still something is wrong with how you see the world, right? So that's an important distinction. Now, how do we relate, and this is where we slip up very badly, how do we relate anti-Semitism to political views? And really there are two buckets here that are important to distinguish. Of course, prejudice is a psychological matter, right? It's a matter of what's going on in somebody's head. And when we're talking about whether an individual outside of a political context, outside of political discourse, public discourse, if you like, is anti-Semitic, we refer to their psychology. In politics, you can't always do that. And you have to label some things anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic, irrespectively of the intent behind them. There has to be that partial severance from psychology when it comes to the political use of various concepts of prejudice, including anti-Semitism. So you could say something somebody says a little bit stinks of anti-Semitism, even though you wouldn't say they're anti-Semitic themselves, but in saying it, especially if they say it in public, it looks like it could be a political act that stinks a bit of anti-Semitism. So there is that inevitable detachment from psychology that politics has to do. And politics also has to be tougher here. Politics can't be too finicky, it can't be too fine about this. So the most gentle and subtle types of prejudice are prejudices that politics should probably just ignore and not count as prejudices. That's why it's possible to go around saying how everybody is racist in private life, but you can't really say that in politics. You can't go around in politics saying that everybody is racist, because you're going to lose the political force of the distinction. So there's racism as a political concept, and there's racism as you might explore it in the sociology department. Same with anti-Semitism. And so you could say that certain slogans have a certain anti-Semitic whiff, for example, even if somebody who is uttering them is psychologically benign. So if somebody is going around, for example, who is perfectly committed to a two-state solution, in principle, is passionate for the Palestinians to have human rights and have a state, passionate for Israel to be a state, but they sing "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," it's not a constructive political act, even though we've seen much of it recently. It's not a constructive political act because the implication is, well, what is the implication, right? But it's very important that political positions, if they're stated clearly and without metaphor, need to be very carefully insulated from anti-Semitism unless they clearly veer into it. So, for example, it's not remotely anti-Semitic to have a position that a lot of Jews, a lot of Israeli Jews, find is very unfair to Israel. That's not anti-Semitic, right? It's not anti-Semitic to be Avishai Margalit, Israel's greatest philosopher, and say, as he does, that outside of the Green Line, Israel isn't a democracy. It's a democracy inside the Green Line, but outside of the Green Line, Israel practices, in Margalit's view, military occupation, colonial rule, apartheid. Obviously, that's not anti-Semitic. Obviously, the Zionist project is entirely compatible with not just recognizing, but embracing that, right? And indeed, a position that I strongly recommend against, which is questioning Israel's right to exist as a state, questioning Israel's legitimacy, in of itself doesn't have to be anti-Semitic. If somebody in a political theory seminar says, I don't recognize, either the way I think about state legitimacy, I don't give Israel a tick, I don't think that's anti-Semitic. I think that's wrong, but it's not anti-Semitic. So you've got to be very careful before you start taking critical positions of Israel which you accept, or critical positions of Israel which you reject, and going on to call them anti-Semitic. You can't do that. You could call them anti-Israel or something if you don't like them, but you can't call them anti-Semitic unless you diagnose something more going on there than the sort of things we've just said are okay. Holocaust. Well, let's stay with Avishai Margalit because I mentioned him. So he has, and this is an interesting testament actually to how much the very best things being said at the moment are being said by Israeli Jews in Israel about what's going on. But Margalit has a wonderful point that he likes to make, which is that we should distinguish remembrance of the Holocaust from taking lessons from the Holocaust. And remembrance is something we should do, taking lessons is something we shouldn't do, he thinks. And I think he thinks that for something like the following reason. Imagine if you took somebody who is the most brilliant person you know, the most historically informed person you know, and you told them, spend 5 minutes talking to me about the lessons of the Holocaust. What's that going to sound like? it's going to sound facile. It's going to sound like, yeah, hatred is really bad, and hatred begets hatred, and like extreme hatred, and then gets genocidal, and then like the hatred and just the racism, and it's so horrible, and we mustn't repeat the horribleness of the horrible things that got so horrible we couldn't imagine could get that horrible. Oh my God. No. So the problem is that the lessons of the Holocaust are too deep to be lessons. What happened is something we have to keep coming back to and keep exploring and keep trying to understand and keep trying to integrate with who we are and where we have come from and where we're going, with enormous space for exploration, enormous space for saying, I don't know how this happened. So the lessons are too deep for us to say that they are lessons, that there are 3 takeaways we need to remember. But if you say that, what should you talk about instead of lessons from the Holocaust? I would talk about being in an adequate relationship with the Holocaust. And I would talk about, and this is what I've written down, that being in an adequate relationship with the Holocaust is an achievement. Which is to say that nobody gets to be in an adequate relationship with the Holocaust in virtue of their group belonging, including Jews. Because to be in an adequate relationship with the Holocaust is to be in touch properly and integrated into one's political life all the things which we just cartoonishly labeled as racism and hatred that were formative conditions of the Holocaust. So, to be in an adequate relationship with the Holocaust is something that you strive toward, is something that you achieve. It's not a status that any group can have, including the most extraordinary victims of it. And that's why that conversation is so deep and so important and so constructive, because it's also a possibility for Israel to explore politically how to move toward being in a more adequate relationship with the Holocaust. Right? And that is always a process and never a matter of group, never a matter of group entitlement. And actually, to be in a proper relationship with the Holocaust might mean something like being a democracy that has an adequate and legitimate and ethical relationship with everybody living inside it and then people living outside it too. So it's an aspirational, it's exploratory thing, and it's also a great teacher about one's own political shortcomings. It's not a matter of group belongings. Now, beautiful community, I'm so grateful for you staying with me through these remarks that just threw little bits of light onto a canvas of darkness without properly illuminating it, and I recognize that. There's a technical thing that I need to make sure I manage to do with the video that's coming tomorrow. But unless something goes wrong with it, the video is essentially finished, and I expect to have it with us tomorrow on the main channel. And it'll be a video about integrating what the hell is going on in the world in a way that connects with all the conversations we've had. And my sense is it's the best one that I've shared so far. I can't wait to welcome you into it tomorrow. Lots of love and talk very soon.